Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to getting up to speed. We sift through the sources you give us and pull out the most important insights. Today, we're diving deep, really deep, to honor Dame Jane Goodall. She was the primatologist, the anthropologist, who truly fundamentally changed how we see the connection between us humans and the animal kingdom. She passed away just recently, in October 2025, at 91. Still active, still campaigning right near the end.
It really is an incredible legacy. I mean, we're talking over 60 years of work. It spans this really intense scientific field work and then just relentless global activism later on. So our mission today, I think, is to go beyond just the biography. We want to really pull out those key scientific discoveries she made and also look at the complex social and ethical frameworks she built, especially how her conservation approach was such a game changer.
Yeah, and you need to understand the context, where she was starting from back in 1960. She had this mentor, the famous paleontologist Louis Leakey. But she wasn't the only one he had this big vision for.
That's exactly right. Leakey had this theory, basically, that studying the great apes, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees could give us major clues about our own early human ancestors, about hominid evolution. So Goodall became one of three pioneering women researchers he backed. People often call them the primates.
The primates, yes.
Yeah, the others were Dian Fossey, who went on to study gorillas, and Birute Galdikas, who focused on orangutans. Goodall's initial mission, maybe she didn't even fully grasp it then, was really to push back against the accepted scientific ideas of what made humans, well, human, unique.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning again. Her origins. Valerie Jane Morris Goodall, born in London, April 1934. Her mother, Margaret Mifenwi Joseph, she was actually a novelist. But what was that really early thing that set her path?
It was a toy chimpanzee, believe it or not. Instead of getting a teddy bear, her father gave her this stuffed chimp. Jubilee, it was called. She was only about 4, and apparently this toy kind of freaked out her mother's friends, but for Jane, it just sparked this immediate, intense love for animals, and that feeling, that connection, eventually pulled her towards Africa.
And that move, right, 1957, she first goes to Kenya. That's where she connects with Leakey, who then pretty quickly sends her into the field in Tanzania.
Yeah.
I mean, looking back, that seems like such an audacious, almost unbelievable step in science history. She gets zero formal training.
None whatsoever. She heads off to Gombe Stream National Park. This is July 1960. No university degree, nothing. Just ready to live among wild chimpanzees. And get this, the chief warden at the time insisted she couldn't go alone. Safety concerns, sure, but also just the norms back then. So her mother actually had to go with her, chaperone her at the start.
Her mother chaperoned your chimpanzee research. That really highlights the barriers, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows you the kind of resistance and skepticism a young woman faced in that field then. It wasn't until 1962, a full 2 years after starting the Gombe research, that Cambridge accepted her for a PhD in ethology. And even that was unusual, one of the very few admitted without a bachelor's degree first. She finished her thesis, Behavior of Free-Living Chimpanzees, in 1966.
Okay, so that brings us right to the fieldwork itself. Gombe. What were those first observations that just completely shattered the way people thought about the line between humans and animals?
Well, the early stuff showed that chimps had these really complex, nuanced social lives and emotions, things that everyone had basically reserved for humans. She documented these deep family bonds, lasting for decades. She saw things we'd recognize instantly: joy, sorrow, hugs, kisses, even tickling. She started talking about them having distinct personalities. That was practically heresy in science back then.
Personalities, right. But the observation that really, truly challenged the definition of humanity, they came down to one specific chimp, David Greybeard.
Correct. That was the absolute game changer. Tool use. She watched David Greybeard using grass stalks to fish termites out of their mounds. Okay, interesting. But the aha moment was seeing chimps take twigs, deliberately strip off the leaves to make the twig a better tool, more effective for getting into the termite mound. That wasn't just tool use, that was basic tool making.
And that's what led to the famous quote from Leakey.
Exactly. Louis Leakey's response sent shockwaves through anthropology. He famously wired her, "We must now redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as human." And her work also blew up the myth that chimps were just peaceful vegetarians. She saw them hunting systematically, eating smaller primates like colobus monkeys. They were organized predators.
How significant was that predation?
Pretty significant. They could consume maybe up to a third of the local colobus monkey population each year, so not just occasional meat eating.
But the research wasn't all sort of warm and fuzzy, discovering human-like traits. It also showed something much darker, didn't it? It forced her to see a complexity that maybe reflected back on us.
Oh, absolutely. That darkness really came into focus during what's known as the Gombe Chimpanzee War, roughly 1974 to 1978. She witnessed systematic violence, incredibly brutal fights within the group, even things like infanticide and cannibalism, particularly by dominant females against rivals. It made her realize, and she wrote about this, that, quote, chimpanzees could be brutal, that they, like us, had a darker side to their nature. That mix, the deep affection and the organized violence, it just demanded a way of studying them that could capture all of that messiness.
Which perfectly leads us to our methods.
Yeah.
Because that complexity, maybe it justified what was seen as the biggest no-no back then, naming her subjects. David Greybeard, Flo, Frodo. Not Chimp 1, Chimp 2. Why was naming them so incredibly controversial in the 60s?
Because the gold standard in behavioral science then was detached, clinical objectivity. Naming your subjects, using terms from human life like childhood or adolescence, that was considered anthropomorphism. You were projecting human feelings onto animals. Critics basically said this emotional connection would bias the research, you'd lose objectivity, the data would be tainted. It would tell us more about her feelings than the chimps' actual lives.
So faced with all that pushback from the scientific establishment, why did she stick to her guns on naming them?
Her argument was actually quite powerful. She said that only by building trust, by getting close, by recognizing them as individuals, which naming helps you do, could she possibly get the kind of detailed, long-term behavioral data she needed. How else could you track family histories over decades, understand lifelong friendships, or figure out the individual motivations behind something like the Gombe War? She needed to know who was doing what to whom and why. So yeah, her methods were controversial then, but they ended up setting a new standard, really, for field primatology.
And it's fascinating, the ripple effect of that. Her success, her visibility using this approach, it ended up completely changing who even did this kind of research.
Totally. She was a trailblazer for women in a field that was almost exclusively male. Her approach, which really valued patience, observation, relationship building, it resonated. And you look today, the field of primatology is nearly an even split, men and women. That's a huge shift, and she was undeniably a major catalyst for that, both by example and by encouraging others.
So this deep academic work eventually kind of morphs into this huge global activism role. There's a clear shift, right? From just observing to becoming an advocate starting around the mid-'80s. What caused that pivot?
Yeah, there was a definite turning point. It was a conference in Chicago in 1986 called Understanding Chimpanzees. She was listening to other researchers present all this grim data habitats disappearing, chimp numbers plummeting across Africa. And it just hit her. Observation wasn't enough anymore. The animals she'd dedicated her life to, their homes, they were vanishing. So she decided right then, essentially, to switch gears, to dedicate the rest of her life to conservation, moving from studying chimps to actively trying to save them. By the early 2000s, like 2004, she was traveling something like 300 days a year.
And she seemed to understand pretty early on that just, putting up fences around a park wasn't the answer. You had to involve the people living there. How did she change the conservation model?
That's key. She moved away from what some call fortress conservation, just excluding local people, towards what's called community-centered conservation. And that idea is really the foundation of the organizations she built, like the Jane Goodall Institute, which she started back in '77. Yes, it supports the Gombe research, but its main focus became driving these local conservation efforts, working with communities.
Right. And the best example of that philosophy in action might be the Take Care program. Can you explain what Take Care is and how it connects human well-being directly to saving chimps?
Take Care is, I think, the perfect example of her integrated approach. Founded in '94 in Tanzania, it stands for Take Care, though originally it was Tanzanian Reforestation and Education. The core idea is pretty simple, but profound. You can't reasonably ask a village living in poverty to prioritize saving chimpanzee habitat if they're struggling to feed their kids or get them an education. It just won't work long term. So Take Care combines things like tree planting, sustainable agriculture training, with programs like microloans for women to start businesses, and crucially, scholarships, especially helping young girls afford higher education. The logic is, if you improve people's lives and livelihoods, you reduce the pressure on the forests, the chimp's home.
That focus on the local community feels so vital. And she also started Roots and Shoots in 1991, right?
Yeah.
Which became this massive global youth program. She really took her message everywhere.
Absolutely. Roots and Shoots started small with just 12 teenagers in Tanzania, and now it's in over 100 countries. It empowers young people to work on environmental, conservation, and humanitarian projects in their own communities. And her advocacy just kept expanding beyond chimps, too. She started promoting vegetarianism, then later veganism. She even put out a book in 2021 called Eat Meat Less. She campaigned really hard against cruelty to animals in labs and on factory farms, co-founded Ethologist for the ethical treatment of animals in 2000. She even pushed for recognizing ecocide as an international crime. All this work, this tireless travel and speaking, led to her being appointed a UN Messenger of Peace in 2002.
Okay, but we're doing a deep dive, so we have to tackle the big scientific controversy around her early Gombe work. The feeding stations. This wasn't just a minor quibble, was it? It was a challenge to the validity of potentially her entire data set.
No, it was definitely a major critique. The practice itself was straightforward. She'd provide bananas at specific locations to draw the chimps in, make them easier to observe regularly, get them used to her presence. The core criticism, pushed by people like primatologist Margaret Power, was that this artificial food source fundamentally changed the chimp's natural behavior. Critics argued that by concentrating the food, she might have inadvertently jacked up aggression levels, altered their natural ranging and foraging patterns. And some even suggested this artificial setup, creating higher density, could have actually caused or at least significantly exacerbated the Gombe chimpanzee war she famously documented.
That's a serious charge.
Yeah.
Did she ever acknowledge the validity of that criticism?
She did, but with nuance. Goodall conceded that, yes, the feeding stations probably did increase the intensity of the aggression observed, and they certainly sped up the habituation process, allowing for those close observations sooner. However, she maintained that they were, at the time, necessary to get the kind of long-term, continuous social data that made her work so uniquely rich, the deep understanding of individual lives and relationships. But importantly, she did say later in her life that if she were starting over today, she absolutely would not use feeding stations. And the main reason she gave wasn't even the behavioral changes, but the increased risk of diseases jumping from humans to chimps. That shows, I think, a willingness to learn and adapt her views based on new knowledge and ethical considerations.
Okay, before we get to the overall legacy, there's one other bump in the road we should mention, that a 2013 book, Seeds of Hope. What was the issue there with plagiarism?
Yes. That was a bit of a PR headache for her. The book was briefly pulled just before its release because reviewers found several passages that were lifted, unattributed from various online sources, including Wikipedia in some cases. Goodall apologized publicly, saying it was down to chaotic note-taking during the writing process. The publisher then delayed the release, added extensive source notes, like 57 pages of them, and re-released it in 2014. So an embarrassing oversight, but it was corrected.
Right. And just to shift gears completely from academic critique to, well, pop culture, there's that famous Far Side cartoon incident. It kind of perfectly captures her unique place in the public imagination, doesn't it?
Oh, that's a classic story. The cartoon from 1987 shows two chimps grooming. One finds a blonde human hair on the other and says, conducting a little more research with that Jane Goodall tramp. Initially, the Jane Goodall Institute was apparently quite upset, called it an atrocity or something similar. But Jane herself, she thought it was hilarious. She later said it was her favorite cartoon depiction of herself and even ended up writing a preface for a Far Side collection.
That's brilliant. That story gets even better, right?
It does. The ultimate irony is that when Gary Larson, the cartoonist, later visited her research station in Gombe, he was actually attacked, thankfully not seriously injured, by one of the chimps, Frodo. Life imitating art, maybe.
Incredible. So, okay, let's step back now. We've looked at the brave start, the groundbreaking, sometimes controversial research, the shift to relentless activism, the honors gamehood, Templeton Prize, Presidential Medal of Freedom just before she passed, and even the public image. When you put it all together, what is the lasting legacy of Jane Goodall?
I think her most profound impact really is ethical and philosophical. On one hand, by showing us the chimps' complex emotions, their tool use, their social bonds, she kind of humanized the animal kingdom in the popular and scientific mind. She narrowed that gap. But then, by also unflinchingly documenting their dark side, the violence, the warfare, the infanticide, she simultaneously, in a way, animalized humans. She showed us these weren't purely human treats, good or bad. She fundamentally blurred that sharp line we used to draw between us and them. It forced a major reevaluation of human exceptionalism and, consequently, our ethical duties towards the rest of nature.
It's like she held up a mirror, showing us our shared evolutionary roots, the capacity for both incredible kindness and calculated brutality existing side by side.
Precisely. And then, if you link that finding back to her activism, her most powerful, practical legacy is that clear understanding. The fate of chimpanzees, and likely all wildlife, is totally intertwined with the fate of the human communities living alongside them. Programs like Take Care are the living proof of her conviction that conservation has to be collaborative. It has to benefit local people, not work against them. She didn't just give us the scientific evidence for our connection to apes, she gave us a model for acting on that knowledge, built around hope and shared well-being.
So maybe the ultimate lesson from Jane Goodall's decades of work isn't just about chimpanzees after all, but about us, about our own species. If our closest relatives show this mix of deep empathy and organized violence, what does that shared history tell us about our own potential? Our capacity for hope and positive action versus our capacity for destruction. She gave us the evidence, didn't she? But applying the ethics, figuring out which path to choose, that's entirely on us now.
That really is the challenge she leaves us with, a powerful one.
And that's all the time we have for this deep dive into the incredible life and revolutionary legacy of Jane Goodall. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.